Hey guys, hope your weekend's going well. We're going to finish up Unit 3 with Evolutionary Psychology. We hit on a little bit in Unit 1, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about it in depth here. And so remember that it is going to deal with the principles by Charles Darwin's natural selection. We're going to talk about that. So natural selection and adaptation. So evolutionary principle psychology, is the study of evolution of behavior and the mind using the principles of natural selection. So it looks at how our behaviors that we see today, that we manifest today, and the way that our mind has developed, those things, how they evolved from our ancestors as early as the Stone Ages, and how they affect us today, and that we still see some of those same behaviors. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that in a little bit. But evolutionary psychologists are people who look to understand how traits and behavioral tendencies, like the way that we tend to behave, how we're predisposed to behave, are shaped by natural selection. So what traits that nature has selected that allowed our ancestors to reproduce and survive. And so natural selection, according to Darwin, is genetic variations increasing the odds of reproducing and surviving are the ones most likely to be passed on to future generations. So the traits that are desirable are the ones that are going to be selected for mates during reproduction. And so those are the ones that get passed on. So very simply, or to simplify natural selection, you have organisms, varied offspring are going to compete for survival. And certain biological and behavioral variations increase organisms' reproductive and survival chances to their particular environment. Right, so whatever is going to allow you to reproduce, so the physical look, traits that people exhibit, are they brave, are they not, and then the natural survival instincts, like we'll talk about later with pregnant women, right, nausea, and aversion to certain foods that could be toxic and other things that make them sick, nauseated, or vomit to get it out of their system. Is a survival instinct of the body, and so those allow people or women to carry their babies to term and not have them sick or anything like that. So those type of traits allow them to be able to survive in particular environments. Offspring that survive are more likely to pass their genes to the ensuing or later generations, and thus over time you have population characteristics also may change. So as your environment changes, as you move to a different environment, and other traits become less desirable depending on the change in your environment, those selections may also change. So there could be change or adaptation over time. The principles of natural selection at work. So researchers, this is an example from your book, Bailiff and Trott are going to attempt to produce domesticated foxes, and so they selected and matched the tamed 5% of a population of male foxes and 20% of that same population of females, tamed, the tamest ones they could find, and they allowed them to reproduce. And they did that over 30 generations of foxes, so 30 different sets of children, and those children's children, and on down the line for 30 generations. And so they repeat this procedure, and eventually they're going to breed a more domesticated fox that's not going to snap and attack other humans that they come into contact with. They become more domesticated and will around for human use. What's important about this study that they did, and the importance is that when generations of species are selected for a particular trait, the offspring become fixed into that particular trait. So when they were selected for being tamed and domesticated, then they produced that trait. So their environment encouraged that. Some genetic variations arise from mutation, however, so that's just random error in gene replication, not because not because it was desirable, not because the environment did it, but because it happened by chance. And so others from new gene combinations are from new gene combinations at conception. Humans share a genetic legacy and are predisposed to behave in ways that promote ancestors surviving and reproducing. So, like we talked about before, the example of pregnant women and nausea. And so, women, they have morning sickness and food aversions, and there are certain things that they can eat. And the idea behind this, or the theory behind this, is that women will become nauseated at foods that would hurt their child, and will not be nauseated, and will be fine with foods that will be fine. So the Stone Age women would be the ones who survived, and the ones whose traits got passed on were the ones who were nauseated at the foods that were toxic to the baby or to the mother, and carrying that child to term. And so if they threw that up or did not eat those toxic plants, then they survived, and so did their baby. And the ones that did not were the ones who didn't have that aversion to the toxic foods. Right. Evolutionary success helps explain our similarities. And so when we look at a quote from your book from Rosenberg et al. 2002, is that no more than 5% of our genetic differences among humans arise from population group differences. So that is talking about the example dealt with Icelandic villagers versus Kenyans. And so there's more variation among Icelandic villagers. Some 95%, it says, of our genetic variation happens within our population. So within Icelandic villagers, there's more variation genetically than there are between Icelandic villagers and Kenyans. So there's two Kenyans are more varied between each other than a Kenyan versus an Icelandicer. And so how might this assessment be explained using males and females? And so it works basically the same way. There's more variation genetically among two males than there would be among a male and a female, because it is our human genome that makes us alike. And so males and females, there's not a whole lot of genetic variability among males and females, but between females, you're going to have more variations of genetics there. All right, so evolutionary psychology today, there is a second Darwin revolution. And so what it is it takes Darwinian principles and applies them in psychological principles. And so you have evolutionary psychologists who, sorry, a little typo there. That's my son Jacob. He's here with us. So evolutionary psychologists ask, over time, what has caused certain behaviors and fears. And so when we look at they wonder, why do infants start to fear strangers about the same time that they start to become mobile? And so as they become mobile, then they're able to get away from their parents, who are protectors of them. And so then naturally you would think that they develop this fear of strangers, and the ones that develop this fear of strangers are ones that survived because they weren't taken advantage of by strangers, in the Stone Ages or whatever. Or they also didn't go far from their parents, so they were able to survive and not run into animals that would eat them as their prey or whatever. And so also, why are biological fathers so much less likely than unrelated boyfriends to abuse and murder the children with whom they share a home? And so you would think this might be common sense, because obviously a biological father wouldn't want to kill their own children or hurt their own children. And that obviously they have a biological link, and that a boyfriend, unrelated boyfriend to the mother, would have no relation to them at all and really wouldn't care. But they want to look at what the link is that makes this happen. So don't use your, avoid that common sense we talked about in Unit 2 to explain that and kind of test it. And so why do many people have phobias of spiders, snakes, and heights over more dangerous threats like guns and electricity, things that can kill you? And so when you think about it from a Stone Age standpoint, right, the animals in that environment might hurt you, and so you had to stay away from them to survive. And so that may be an explanation for why that happens. So evolutionary psychology has an explanation for human sexuality, and so it looks at men and women and their sexual activity and says men tend to have a recreational view of sexual activity, right, for fun or for pleasure, and women tend to have a relational view for sexual activity. And so how do evolutionary psychologists explain the differences there? And so it says, they would say that one man can spread his genes throughout many females and is capable of fathering more children at one time than a woman can mother and carry a child to term. And so men are more free in that area where they don't have that responsibility like women do. But on the flip side of that, women have to incubate and nurse one infant at a time by pairing wisely. And so a woman increases the odds that her genes will be passed into the future. And so they choose their mates more. Women choose their mates more wisely because they have to carry that child to term. And for lack of a better term, they're kind of stuck with that situation. So what's important about these presumed differences is that people believe them to be true, and women look for older, mature, and settled mates for partners, while men look for younger, fertile women for partners. And so you see those differences, but those things have to be tested to be proved. And so we know that today some of those things may not be as true. So what are some of the criticism of evolutionary psychology? One is that they start with an effect and work backwards to an explanation, and so that can cause some biases. Also, that they do not recognize the social and cultural influences that may be in play, and so you can't discount those things. And also that it may absolve people or excuse them from taking responsibility from their sexual behaviors, which we call genetic determinism, right? That our genetics determine what our behaviors are going to be. And so it takes responsibility out of the equation for people, right? You have the right to make a choice, and if you have something that you can kind of pass it off on, then it increases the likelihood that behavior will continue. So what's the response of evolutionary psychologists to these criticisms? One is that they say to understand our predispositions, or the things that we're more likely to do because of our genetics, it can help us overcome them. And so by understanding what our predispositions are, we can find ways to change or adapt. And they also cite the value of testable predictions or hypotheses and theories based on evolutionary principles, so as well as the coherence and explanatory powers of those principles, who we are and why we do what we do. All right, so this is the evolutionary psychology unit, and so we'll begin our review and take our test tomorrow. Have a good day.